Good morning. Good morning. So I get up here at about like 7:15 every day. Today I get up here and I did not bring my key card. I had to go all the way back home. Like I usually just leave it in my car. I didn't even think about it because it's always in my car in the little dashboard area. It wasn't there. I had to go all the way back home and then come back. So the reason why I get up here at 7:15 every day is so that I can review before we do the lesson. So today I didn't get a chance to review. So we're coming in cold. Okay, so I started grading your gallery reports. I have not finished. I should finish today though. So keep a lookout for your grade. If you have any questions about your grade, feel free to reach out and ask. For those of you that did not turn it in, you should read the syllabus and check out the section about missing work. I'm going to leave that up to you to do though. I'm not going to tell you what it says. Okay. This week we're going to be finishing our mediums. Today's the last medium. It's architecture. Starting tomorrow, we're going to get into art history. For this week's assignment, you guys do have a discussion post on Friday. This super short discussion post over chapter 16. So you're going to want to make sure to take really good notes on that particular chapter when we go over it. And then next week, all week, I'm going to be giving you guys time to work on your group presentations. I told you guys on Thursday that you might want to be thinking about who your partners are going to be for that group project. Your group presentation is over chapters 18, 19, and 20. So for that project, you guys are going to be choosing, I believe I said 2. I always change my mind on this. Yes, 2 artifacts from chapters 18, 19, and 20, any 2 artifacts. Preferably 2 that you could link together and make a cohesive presentation so it doesn't seem like 2 separate presentations. So keep that in mind. Like I said, you're going to have all next week to work on it in class. But just to go ahead and get you guys started to think on it, your presentation should be 15 to 20 slides in total. For example, you can have 10 slides over the first and 8 slides over the second. That's 18. It's within the range. I said on here that I will create the groups, but this is a small enough class that I feel like you guys could probably accomplish that on your own. Plus, we're all here and not like there. Here are some requirements. Make sure your presentation is purposeful, cohesive, and clear. Every slide and image used should have a reason for it to exist in your presentation. Don't just put in a random picture and that's it. Like, I need some sort of an explanation about that particular picture. If your artifact has an artist included with it, feel free to include other works by that same artist to expand on your presentation topic. Also, if you are in a multicultural chapter, feel free to enlighten us about the cultures or religions that might have played a part in the creation of that artifact. A good chunk of the stuff from chapters 18 and 19 and 20 have to do with like Buddhism and Hinduism. Feel free to include a little bit of a breakdown about like the basics of Buddhism and the basics of Hinduism. It'll probably help us understand your art better. Of course, be creative. If you have concerns, feel free to reach out to me and we can set up a tutorial to throw around ideas. Your presentation is going to be graded on a 1 to 5 scale on the following subjects: content relevant and pertinent for that particular artwork, creativity, time, thought, and effort put into the development of the cohesive and nice looking presentation. Length, it should be 15 to 20 slides. Citations, all outside information should have citations including images. Group effort, you will be required to submit a survey answering some questions about everyone's group involvement. So you are getting graded on group participation. I think I mentioned on Thursday that the college requires us to do some sort of group project to see if you guys are capable of working with other people. So this one is very much going to be looking at group effort. So if you're the kind of person, I'm going to tell you what people have gotten counted off on in the past. If you're the kind of person that doesn't answer your messages or check your emails and respond to your group members, you're not going to get a good group survey from them. You're just not. So make sure you're keeping in contact with those other people. Otherwise, they're going to feel like they're on an island by themselves doing all the work, and you're not. And they're going to tell me in that group effort, you'd be surprised. You think that people are going to cover for you. They don't, because they're irritated at that point usually. Overall presentation, does your presentation do a good job of educating me on your items? Perfect score, each category adds up to 30 points. So this is due on the 17th, which, to give you an idea, because it's a little bit of a different day, it's due on Wednesday, the 17th. That's because on Thursday we're going to present. Okay, any questions about that? Does anyone know who's going to be in their group? As you figure out who you want in your group, just email me or let me know in class or text me, and I'll go ahead and set those groups up for you guys. Okay. But keep in mind that that is a kind of big assignment. It's not really like graded big, but it takes a lot of time. So yeah. Any questions about this week's assignment, the discussion post? As I said, this week is today is our last day of media arts. Starting on Tuesday, we will begin going over art history, beginning with super old stuff and going into contemporary is where we're going to end off this semester. So we're going to be covering a lot of time tomorrow. Today, we're just doing architecture. Architecture is a lot like sculpture, in which it's mostly key terms and examples of key terms. We're not going to be able to go over all of the different buildings. A lot of the buildings that I'm showing as examples of vocabulary words are ones that we're going to be going over tomorrow anyways. So to save some time today, we're not going to go over them all because we're going to have to do it again anyways. So key terms to start off with, and then we'll go over the different examples of them. First word, masonry, is just stacking stones to make something. That's like the most basic rudimentary form of masonry. Dressed stones are a form of masonry in which the stones have been specifically shaped for that spot. Post and beam, also known as post and lintel, that's what I'll probably call it today and the rest of the semester. Another very, very basic form of architecture. That's when two posts hold up the weight of a beam. The arch is the more evolved form of the post and beam. That's when stones are packed together in an arching shape that is held in place with a capstone or keystone. And I promise all of this is going to make sense in a second when we go through examples. A colonnade is a row of columns. I'm pretty sure all of us probably know what a column is. It's just like a post. And a pier is a really, really thick column. Okay, an arcade is a series of arches supported with columns. Once again, a keystone or capstone is that final stone that's placed on top of the arch. It holds the entire arch together. Without the keystone, the arch would fall. Concrete is a particular material that was introduced by the Romans. I think we all know what concrete probably is. Minarets are four towers that denote cardinal directions, usually seen in Islamic architecture. And the Gothic arch is a type of arch that is pointed at the top instead of round. So next we're going to be going over actual examples of these vocabulary words. But to start off with, we are going to look at the oldest example of architecture that we have in our book, which is the dolmen. So key points that architects tend to think about when they're making buildings are function, form, and structure. Depending on the particular architectural trends, they'll put more emphasis on one of those over the others. But function is how the building will be used, what's its purpose. Form is how it looks, and structure is how the building stands up. Structure is something that's usually always taken into account because you don't want your building to fall down on you. But form and function will differ in what architects consider as more or less important. For example, our dolmen that we're looking at right now, clearly the architect that made this, if you want to call him an architect, cared more about function than form. Maybe not so much about structure either, I don't know. Although this is from a really, really long time ago and it's still standing. It's from the prehistoric Paleolithic era. So the Stone Age, so BCE era, and it's still standing up. So maybe they did do a good job with the structure, I don't know. But there are other time periods in architecture in which architects care a lot more about the form. I'm thinking more of like the Gothic era than they do function. They care more about what it looks like than its purpose. So those two particular key issues that go into designing a building will change a little bit depending on the period and the trends that are happening in architecture. So like I said, our dolmen here, which is located in France, there's a few of these throughout. These would have been shelters that of course would have had like branches and stuff for the actual walls of the building during the Paleolithic era. As stated, they are still standing today. Not all of them. Some of them are, some of them aren't. These rocks are extremely heavy. So knowing that, would you guys want to take shelter under this if you had to? You know, the choice of being drenched in a rainstorm or standing under this, what would you choose? You'd be wet?
No, I don't, especially since you said it's been publicly.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd go under it too. It's just a simple post and lintel construction, except here instead of 2 posts, we have 3 posts carrying our beam on top. The beam acts as the roof. As stated, originally it would have had branches and shrubbery shrouding the sides to keep you a little bit warm in the cold weather. So it does serve its purpose, and it is a functioning structure. Of course, architecture has come a long way since then. Obviously, we're in a building right now and it does not look like that. But traditional architecture used wood, stone, and then later on brick. You would use those particular materials and think about how to best use them to support your structure. You think, oh, wood is really light. Stone is really heavy. Which of these should go on the bottom? Probably the stone. I wouldn't want a house made of wood and then a giant 2-ton stone on top of it. That would not be a good deal. So early architects thought of things like that with their materials. Early masonry was called it's called dry masonry still. That's just the idea of stacking stones on top of each other to make a structure. Later on, stone dressing comes along, and it is a form of masonry that is not dry masonry, in which you actually shape the stones to fit in a specific interlocking spot, making your structure a little bit more sturdy and getting rid of some of the gaps in the walls and structure. So your dolmen that we just looked at would be a good example of dry masonry. Those stones were not shaped or rounded or made into blocks to hold up that structure. More advanced civilizations after the Paleolithic era did start shaping their stones to properly fit into spots. Some examples of actual stone dressing masonry, the Great Zimbabwe. At Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe just means big house, that word. So this like functioned as a really large communal house for the people in Zimbabwe. Here's a interior view of that structure. So you can see these stones have been shaped to fit their specific location. They're not as roughly stacked as that dolmen was. Because they have been shaped, there aren't large gaps in between stones. Another example of stone dressing with masonry is the pyramids. These guys would have gone to the quarries and taken chisels and hammers with them to make perfectly rectangular blocks. If those blocks had not been perfect, those pyramids would not be standing. They would have fallen a long time ago. If you take the art history course, you're going to learn a whole lot about the interior of these pyramids and how exactly these stones were shaped and created to fit those specific spots. Because the inside of this does have hollow chambers, and most of these stones weigh several tons. The stones on bottom weigh about 15 tons. That's a lot. And these pyramids go below as well. So it's not just the inside that is hollow. There's an underground chamber as well that is hollow that these architects took into account when they were creating these. Also, fun fact, these pyramids, you can kind of still see it at the top of the Great Pyramid, which is the largest one. They used to be covered in a smooth white limestone. It's not so white anymore, but they didn't used to look like a bunch of steps. They used to be covered in this smooth white barrier over top, and that has just deteriorated over time. And then you have your three small step pyramids. These guys are step pyramids. You can kind of see there are 3 steps. Those are for the wives. Another example of dressed masonry, Machu Picchu. All of the buildings here have stones that have been shaped for their specific spots in those buildings, which is why they're still standing today, after a long period of time. Same with the Pueblo dwellings at Mesa Verde, another example of stone dressing. So as you can see, stone dressing enables buildings to stand up for a really, really long period of time. It makes them very durable and very functional. So function triumphs form for this particular era. Another architectural design that developed a little bit after stone dressing is post and lintel. It's a very, very fundamental principle. It pops up in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, all of those particular civilizations, Mesopotamia as well. And that's just the idea of posts holding up a beam or a lintel, which secures the structure. A very rudimentary example of post and lintel, but this is what early post and lintel looked like. It's just 2 posts in a lintel or a beam, same thing. What does this remind you of? Huh? Oh, yeah, kind of the first one. Yeah, it's post and lintel too. I'm thinking of like a more famous one though. Stonehenge, yes, it's all post and lintel. Stonehenge is entirely post and lintel structures. For Stonehenge, there's an inner circle and an outer circle of stones. The outer circle is the one that's most commonly associated with that post and lintel format. The inner circle is kind of collapsed. The outer circle is comprised of your basic large several ton stones. Your inner circle is a bit special. It's made of blue stones that have been quarried from about 50 miles away and carted there. They're also extremely heavy. So they would have used like rollers to roll the stones along the roads. This is of course called a henge. A henge means a circle. Stone, it's made of stone circle. That's all that translates to. It serves several purposes over time, and we're going to be talking a lot about it tomorrow when we're going over Paleolithic and Neolithic art and architecture, because it is kind of a big Paleolithic one. It's pretty much the only Paleolithic art that really England has to go for it. Most Paleolithic art came from Africa and France. Funny enough. Your example of colonnade. Colonnade is just a row of columns. These guys are columns. A whole bunch of them together makes a colonnade. See, these are not too hard. This is the key at Florence Cathedral. It's called the key because it's in the shape of a keyhole. It has to do with in the Catholic Church, the very, very first pope. Does anyone remember who that is? No? Paul. So supposedly Christ gives the keys to the church to Paul, and there's a whole bunch of artistic renditions of that. And Florence likes to celebrate that fact. So they made like a keyhole to represent the fact of Christ giving the keys to the church to the first pope. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more in a second about this guy in the back. Does anyone know what this structure is called? No? Well, you're going to find out in a couple of seconds. It's a dome. So the structure in the back at Florence Cathedral is a dome. Domes are first created by the Romans in Roman architecture. You're also going to find out about that on chapter 16 because Rome is in that one. This particular dome is the Dome of the Rock at Jerusalem. Has anyone heard of that one? Wow. You guys need to get out more. So the Dome of the Rock at Jerusalem is really, really famous because 3 major world religions claim it as theirs. I mean, the city of Jerusalem is constantly being fought over, particularly between the Jewish and Islamic people. Both of them claim it as their city. Jerusalem itself is a holy city. And this particular building is one of the major points that they're constantly battling over. Here at the top, you can kind of tell that at the time this particular picture was taken, the Islamics were in charge of this building because that is a crescent moon at the top, which is one of their symbols. So the Dome of the Rock is a lovely octagon-shaped building, which you can kind of see, that has a lot of Islamic architectural references. You can see that with the calligraphy on the top band and the mosaics. The Islamic people are really famous for mosaics. And they're also really well known for domes. This particular dome is not your basic dome. This is an onion dome. So it's a bit pointed at the top, which is traditional Islamic dome. A regular dome is round at the top, not quite pointed. But this particular building, it was built around a rock, which is why it's called the Dome of the Rock. The rock is supposedly the place where Abraham tried to sacrifice Isaac in the Bible. So if you're familiar with that story, Abraham was asked by God to go to the mountaintop and sacrifice his only son, but then God stops him and gives him a goat instead. So supposedly that rock is the altarpiece in which Isaac was almost sacrificed. It's also supposedly the location where Muhammad rose up to heaven. So like the place that he ascended heaven, like into heaven at. So it's important for the Jewish, obviously, and the Christians, because it's in our Christian Bible as well. But it's also extremely important for Islamic religion. If you're not familiar with Islam, they're very, very similar to Christian and Jewish. They just think that instead of like Christ being the final prophet, that Muhammad is instead. They still believe that Christ is the Son of God. They just believe that Muhammad was another prophet that came after him. It's literally almost identical if you're going with basic Muslim and not like the offshoots. I mean, Christianity has a lot of offshoots too, but yeah, there's some crazy Christian offshoots too. That happen in the world. So that rock is in the very, very center of this building, right underneath that dome. And like I said, those religions are constantly fighting over who actually owns that building. And it changes hands a lot, but it is done in the traditional Islamic style. Another dome, this is the dome of the Florence Cathedral, just close up. This dome was created during the Baroque period. It kept falling in on itself. So with domes, there's a particular like geometry and physics that have to go into creating them. If you don't get your geometric measurements and understand physics correctly, it's gonna fall down. It's gonna go in on itself. So during the Renaissance, which was when this was first starting to be constructed, they kept trying to make the dome really, really wide. But what ends up happening is this. They didn't realize that they needed to go higher and make it thinner in order to balance out the weight of the actual dome. So it wasn't until the Baroque period that they finally figured out that they needed to just make it taller instead of rounder. So it's also a little bit of a unique dome. Florence Cathedral, really, really famous cathedral. If you ever go to Italy, that would be the one cathedral I'd tell you to check out. And there is the key. So this is here, and it overlooks the key, which has that colonnade that goes off into the city of Florence. That takes us into arches. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of arches. You only really need to know two. The first arch that you really, really need to know is your basic Roman arch. The second arch that you need to know is your Gothic arch. The others you won't come across in this class. You will if you take art history. But in this class, these are the only two. Well, you'll see a trefoil arch, but we're not going to talk about it. We're only going to mention the Lancet arch and the Roman arch. So your Roman arch is your most basic arch, although technically the Corbel arch existed beforehand, but we aren't going to talk about that one in this class either. Your Roman arch is your perfectly rounded arch. You can see your capstone right here. Your capstone is what holds it all together. So the way it functions is it is inserted last, and it puts pressure on those wings of the arch so that they stay in place. If you don't have that pressure, they're once again going to end up falling in on each other. Your Gothic arch has two capstones. So there are two stones in this spot right here that help to keep everything pressurized and in their place. And like I said, they all have their capstone. The Corbel arch, it's really easy to see the capstone or the keystone. It's the one at the very top. The flat arch, your keystone's in the center. It's always the stone that's at the very, very central topmost point in your arch. Here is an example of a whole bunch of arches put together. Does anyone remember the vocabulary word for a bunch of arches? Arcade, very good. So here we have an arcade, 3 rows of arcades, actually. This is the Pont du Gard at Nimes, France, and it is an aqueduct. Does anyone know what an aqueduct is or what it does? Yeah, very good. Did you read? You just know what an aqueduct is? Oh, yeah, world geography. So this was created also by the Romans. As I stated, the Romans are kind of the ones that invent arches. The Romans invent a lot of things: domes, arches, concrete, sewer systems, aqueducts. So this exists in France at the time in which the Roman Empire expanded all the way into like England. It was huge at one point. It went from England into Asia, into parts of Africa, really, really big. So at the height of the Roman Empire is when this particular one was made. And as you can see, there are obviously 3 layers of Roman arches. These layers, this top one and this one right here, carry rivers of fresh water. So what happened in France is one of the towns in France, when they were under Roman control, had no access to fresh water. And the only freshwater system was several miles away, and it was across a deep ravine. So what the Romans did is they created their normal water system through most of it, but they had to come up with some new architectural design to get the water across this particular cavern or chasm over to the actual town. So they created this aqueduct in order to transport it. It still technically functions today. I mean, they don't need to use it today because modern technology, we don't need to use aqueducts anymore. But there is still water flowing in it today from one side to the other. So they did do a really great job. Another example of an arch, a triumphal arch. Triumphal arches pop up throughout the world. They just celebrate victories. That's why they're called triumphal arches. This particular triumphal arch is in Paris, France. There's another triumphal arch in London. There's another one in Venice. They're all over the place. They just celebrate, like I said, different victories. The one in London celebrates World War I, remembering those that died in World War I, and it's a triple triumphal arch, so it has 2 small ones over to the side. But once again, for this, you just use your basic Roman arch to create it. And of course, they decked it out with a bunch of high and low relief sculptures. This takes us into Gothic arches. Gothic arches are your pointed arches. I don't think we need to do much more on this. This is a little snippet of the Notre Dame des Chartres Cathedral. Just a little background, there's a lot of Notre Dames. It just means that it was dedicated to Mary. There's a lot. The one that most people think of is the Paris Notre Dame, which was done at the very end of the Gothic era. This is Notre Dame des Chartres. It's a few miles away from Paris in Chartres, France, or Chartres, France, depending on who you're asking. This particular Notre Dame was first begun at the beginning of the Gothic era, and then it was added onto at the very end of the Gothic era. That's really important because the style changes throughout the Gothic time period. Early Gothic era, well, let me back it up a little bit. So before the Gothic era, there was something called the Romanesque period of architecture. We're going to learn more about this in the art history section, so if you can't remember, that's fine. But the Romanesque era was a revival of Roman architectural style. So a lot of columns, a lot of Roman arches, a lot of arcades, a lot of colonnades. During the Gothic era, they tried to expand on that architectural style, but make it lighter and airier because they wanted to incorporate windows, particularly stained glass windows. That's when those were invented, was the Gothic era. The reason being is that people felt that stained glass windows made you feel like you were in heaven. They made you see light and remember light, and light is heaven, heaven is good. The color is also very majestic and ethereal, like heaven. So in order to incorporate all of these stained glass windows obviously can't support weight. They're glass. They had to come up with new architectural designs. So instead, they added these things off to the side. These are called flying buttresses to help take the weight off of the interior walls and spread it to the exterior. So normal walls, they would just use a whole bunch of concrete. Concrete's really, really heavy, or a whole bunch of stone. It'd be really, really thick. But you couldn't add a huge window like this and have a solid concrete wall. So instead of leaving it like this, they had it go like this. Have the weight directed out to the outside space to try and help incorporate all of those windows. The interior of these buildings also has a lot less columns. With less columns on the inside means you have less structural support. They made their columns a lot thinner, and like I said, they didn't have nearly as many. The columns during the Romanesque era for churches were really, really large and thick and dense. So they had that structural support. The columns in the Gothic era didn't. So once again, they needed that exterior structural support for both the windows and the interior. In a second, we'll look at the interior. Of course, you see the Gothic arches were used in multiple areas. Here's our rose window at the front. A round window like that is called a rose window. And of course, towers. Now, I say this was done at the early Gothic era because towards the end of the Gothic era, things would not be this simple looking on the exterior. You can kind of see a hint to that at the back with this tower in the background. Let's see if I have another picture. No, I don't. So this tower in the forefront was done when the rest of this church was built. The tower in the background burnt down, and they rebuilt it at the end of the Gothic era, incorporating the final Gothic architectural ideals. So it's very, very ostentatious and over the top. We're going to watch a video in a second. You'll get a better close-up of that one. And of course, here's a close-up of those flying buttresses that help take some of the pressure off of the side. And another close-up. So all of this is almost entirely glass. You only have really thin areas of stone. So to support that, they ended up having to add those miniature buttresses to take the weight off. There's your interior of the rose window. Like I said, we are going to be watching a video, your columns. Let me get that video up. And we're going to do a little bit of an activity after the video too. I always do that. And I am going to show you front because they didn't really mention it there. So here you can really see the difference between those two towers. This one made during the beginning of the Gothic era, this one at the very end. As I stated, Notre Dame de Paris was made towards the end of the Gothic era, so it's got a lot more going on than Chartres does. It's got a lot of those. Of course, this is post being burned down. So a lot pointier, a lot more added details to all of it. See if I can get a better picture. Of course, it's the front that everyone really remembers. So it has several rows windows versus just the one. Here's the back side of it. So very, very detailed as far as representing Gothic architecture, both of them are. Now, I said that we are going to do an activity, and here's the time. So I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds to sum up what you thought of Chartres Cathedral. And more than just, I like it or I don't. Tell me why. Or why not. 30 seconds to sum it up. One sentence. You need to write it down, you can. Because you're not going to be telling me. You'll be telling someone else. We're going to be looking at this church again later on too. Okay, now stand up. And find someone in class that you've never ever talked with before and go tell them what you wrote. Surely there's someone you've never talked to. Gabriel, can you unmute for a second? Gabriel. No one muted. Okay.
I see the shining light. Yeah.
When you're done, you can go sit back down. That'll let me know when everyone's done. Okay, like I said, everyone's going to get to know a little bit more about that cathedral later on because there's a lot of other things that we haven't talked about yet with it, particularly a lot of the reliefs and the stories that they depict. They only started talking about them there. But another church that is important in the history of architecture is this one. This is Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia was originally an early Christian church built during the Byzantium period, which is when the Roman Empire split into an Eastern Empire and your normal Roman Empire, because they got too big to govern all as one empire. During this time, the capital of Rome was also moved from Rome to Byzantium, which is where this church is located, present day Istanbul. Why would Rome move the capital of Rome? I don't know. Shortly after that, the entire Roman Empire collapsed. So yeah, this was built once again during that Byzantium period. This is prior to Romanesque, prior to Gothic, which is why it looks a little bit more basic in comparison to the church that we just looked at. But it's no less of an architectural feat. So here you see once again a minaret. This Islamic piece was added later on after the Muslims conquered Byzantium. And then they converted the entire church from a Christian church to a Muslim mosque. The minarets were also added later. So these four towers are minarets. Minarets help mark the four cardinal directions, because in Muslim religion, you are supposed to pray several times a day facing Mecca. Mecca is the holy land for them, so that just helps them figure out which direction they need to be praying in. It helps them there. The interior of this, as stated, used to be Christian. It now looks a little bit more like this. There are still some Christian imagery left, but a lot of it was removed. In Muslim religion. It's considered a sin to have a lot of images of biblical figures, because they think that you're worshiping the figure instead of like actually contemplating your religion. There's other religions that we're going to be talking about later that think the same way. But this is just the first one. So that's why you see, instead of paintings of like Christ or biblical figures, you have calligraphy here. And yeah, so a lot of gold interior. There's also a short video on this one. We're not going to watch the entire thing, but this one has a lot of architectural ingenuity that was occurring that was very new for that time period, as stated before the Gothic era. This is still in relatively early in world civilization. So these pendentives are solid concrete that helps to support the weight, and also the weight is like similarly to the Gothic church being spread outwards instead of coming all the way down. So it's being spread from these pendentives to this half dome to this outside area, as well as these other solid blocks of concrete right here. And here you can see that that earthquake has kind of messed with some of that dome. Some of the columns on the interior are also not straight anymore. They're a bit crooked, just because once again, the weight of that dome and the earthquake shaking it did mess with the building's structure a little bit. And that's all we're going to watch on that one. I just wanted you to understand how that dome was being held up by pendentives, which was a little bit of a new thing for that time period. Of course, today we have steel and better building materials versus just concrete and block. Concrete and block are really, really heavy, not great at supporting a lot of weight either. Steel and more modern materials are a lot better at preventing things from falling. What we're going to be doing next is going through some different art and architectural trends, starting with Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau popped up in France. It was all about trying to make things look organic and lifelike. It started originally as an interior design trend, and then it moved its way into advertising and architecture. The most famous Art Nouveau architect was Antonio Gaudi, famous mostly in Barcelona. If you ever go to Barcelona, Spain, a lot of his stuff is there, including this particular house known as the Dragon House. Here he's tried to incorporate natural forms by making things look like skeletal objects. So this kind of looks like a spine, these balconies, and then these also look like bones. Also, the front is covered in tile, glass tile mosaics, kind of trying to reference dragon scales. The roof does a little bit of a better job of referencing dragon scales. Another Antonio Gaudi, Sagrada Familia Church. This was once a regular Gothic cathedral. He added a whole bunch of stuff to it. He never actually finished. This is still under construction today, and Art Nouveau happened in the 1800s. So still going on today, but as you can see, it is definitely not your regular Gothic cathedral. He's added a lot more stuff to it. The interior, well, here's a little bit closer up of the exterior. So he wanted it to look like it had just risen up from the earth. So he echoed like mud. It reminds me of like those bird's nests that come around every summer that just make them out of mud and make a mess everywhere. Yeah, those barn swallows. The interior is supposed to look like a forest. So he's converted the columns and made them very thin and tree-like and added all of those details to the ceiling. He's also changed the stained glass windows out from like religious imagery to just almost like a tie-dye natural effect to it. So a bit ahead of his time, I think. He became so obsessed with building this church though that he like lived in it. And he didn't leave it. No one had seen him for 30 years until one day he accidentally got hit by a car and people identified him and they're like, oh, yeah, that guy. Yeah, he died after living in the cathedral for 30 years and nobody knew what he looked like. And he got hit by a car in the middle of the night. Yep, sad story. Don't become obsessed with things, I guess. I don't know. We're not going to watch that video. We're going to go instead into another art trend, the Chicago School, famous in the US. It happens once again because of new technologies, particularly steel. Steel frames were first used during the Chicago style of architecture. It began with Louis Sullivan. And it is just your basic box. with windows. Very commercial, used mostly for office buildings, and cared a lot more about function over form. Thanks to the invention of steel frames and the introduction of the Chicago style of art, there ended up being a competition between Chicago and New York City as to who could make the tallest building. For a little while, Chicago held on with that title with the Sears Tower, but eventually, obviously, New York beat them out. And today there's still competitions going on who can build the tallest building in the world. I think the tallest one's in Dubai now, isn't it? I think it's Dubai. Another Sullivan building, this one's by Adler and Sullivan. This is the Wainwright building. This is located in St. Louis, Missouri. And you can still go visit it today. It's an office building, so I wouldn't recommend going there, but yeah. Thanks to steel beams, we're able to get these taller buildings. Prior to steel beams, the tallest you could get was like 3 or 4 floors with concrete. So it definitely changed a lot of architecture. And eventually you can see what it will become in the background there with your skyscraper, your steel skyscraper. That's the international style. We're about to get to that one. Chicago style still incorporates a lot of brick as well as some design details. So for this one, Wainwright echoes Roman and Greek pediments. So if we get a closer look, if we pay attention when we're going over chapter 16, Greeks add things called friezes to their temples. A frieze is just a little band detail, which the band is right here on this one, that shows usually a story. This one doesn't show a story though, it just shows some ivy. But yeah, he steals some ideas from the Greeks there. Same with the windows, the little detail underneath the window. That doesn't exist in the international style. Obviously, once again, you can see in the background. The international style is literally your glass box. The international style is about incorporating those new building materials, but also adding as many windows as possible. The more windows you add to a building, the more your building feels like it expands as far as the interior. If you're familiar with a lot of windows or like mirrors or something inside your room, it makes your room feel bigger. So they wanted to make the rooms and spaces feel bigger, but still hold that functional purpose and kind of incorporate the exterior into the interior with those windows. So the international style, very boxy, but with a lot of windows. So very, very similar to this, but with a lot of windows. The very, very first example of international style is Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye. International style pops up simultaneously over different areas of Europe. So it's not characteristic to one location, like Art Nouveau started in France and then spread. Chicago style started in Chicago and spread. International style popped up simultaneously in different locations. So no one location gets to call that one. International style, really, really popular still today, which is why we still see skyscrapers everywhere. Bauhaus is another example of the international style. Philip Johnson's house here, another example of the international style. This one is in a very extreme version of the international style, in which he's literally only used steel and glass to create a house. This is a house. You could actually purchase these for a really long time. Yeah, I don't know if you want to live in that. There's the bathroom on the other side of this, and the kitchen's on the other side of this, and there's a bedroom on the other side of the bathroom. So yeah, kind of cool. Mies van der Rohe, another example of someone building a house using the international style. So a lot of glass once again. And of course, it eventually will look more like this. This is your standard international style building. Frank Lloyd Wright is a popular American architect, and he's the last thing that we're going to be talking about today. Frank Lloyd Wright invented a couple of things. He is primarily known for his work in Chicago in the Midwestern United States. But he invents first off the prairie house style. Prairie house style is what we have a lot around here. It's your flat, long, one-story house. Most of us know what that is. It's prairie. It's long, flat, one story. He also invents the cantilevered roof, which is what you see here. That is a roof that extends past the building. So like a carport or a porch or a patio. So that roof has gone out past, and underneath that is a patio. This particular building was built before 1920. And it is located in Chicago. It's the Roby House. You can go visit it. Someone lives in it. If you buy a Frank Lloyd Wright house, you are not allowed to change anything because they're like considered artworks now, and they're kind of like national treasures. He's really the only major architect that we get to claim in the United States. You can't change the interior decor or exterior. But I mean, considering that this was made before the Model T, it's pretty up on trends as far as the house. The interior is very much an Art Deco style. Like I said, you can't change the interior either. Here's another picture of the interior of the Roby House. He chose every single feature on the inside too. And the last thing from Frank Lloyd Wright, his masterpiece, is Falling Waters, located in Pennsylvania. Falling Waters is built on top of a creek bed. So it works with the natural surrounding. It's very advanced for the time period, because once again, we're talking early 1900s here. Instead of building it next to the creek, you see the creek is literally flowing through the house. Here you can see, you can walk down onto the water, which is cool. And he built the house on top of the creek bed. So the floor of the home is made entirely of creek bed rock. And of course, he incorporated a large amount of windows as well as natural decor to fit with that theme of trying to incorporate nature into the house. So yeah, Falling Waters, fun one. I want to go there someday. That's like the one Frank Lloyd Wright house that I actually want to see. I've seen the Roby house. It's pretty cool, but this one looks a lot neater. Obviously not prairie house style. This is multi-leveled. Like I said, this is like the masterpiece. He did this one towards the end of his career. You still see cantilevered roofs being used though. And of course, a lot of stone masonry. And tomorrow we're starting art history. Tomorrow we're going to be beginning with the prehistoric Paleolithic era. We're going to begin with 70,000 BCE. And by the end of class tomorrow, we will make it into not BCE. So we're going to be covering a lot tomorrow. Come prepared for that. It is a bit daunting. Like it's not a super long lesson, but it's a lot of time to cover in one class. So be ready for that. I see you guys tomorrow. If you have any questions about any of the group project or discussion, let me know. If you figure out who you want your partner to be, also let me know about that too.